All right, and welcome to a new mini series I'm starting. It's going to be Obfuscate.min, where I'll do some pre-recorded videos of problems that I'm having, and I'll try and make them shorter than like a whole live stream. I know my live streams usually go on for a little bit. I mess up on stuff, and this is still kind of like live coding, like I'm doing it, but I'll chop this up, make it a little bit more palatable, digestible, and it's just a way to get more content out there, as well as making sure that people pay attention to it and things like that. Great. So we have a problem here. This is taken from something I've been doing here is a bit of a ClickUp library, if you will. I don't know how you would call it, but essentially it's just a bit of core functions that to use and manipulate and work with ClickUp. What I'll be doing in this is trying to make this drier. So there's a portion of this that I reuse all the time. And dry, or the dry concept, is don't repeat yourself. Now, what I often do is like when I'm working on something and I've done it or I'm doing it for the first time, I don't know what's going to be repeated, or I don't know the best way to handle certain things, if I can actually reuse any bit of code or a block of code, reuse variables and things like that. So I will write it out completely. And then now, or later on, later iterations, I'll go back and I'll try to make it dry, or take out bits of code or code blocks so that I can actually dry it out, make it simpler, and also make it more maintainable. So with this, I can see pretty quickly there's an Axios call, and that's what I'm going to focus on. There's an Axios call that I always have to make to a third-party API. Now, as far as the core portion of the Axios call, it's always the same. Like, I'm just going to await this and get this piece of code here. So what I can actually do is just make that into a function and just take that out. Then after that, I can actually use any type of for loops or anything else like that. So I can parse all of that and go from there. Now, I can also make this a little bit easier for me as well, because if I look at this even closer, in the then, it's going to take the ID, and then it's going to run that through a for loop, and then I'm going to, go ahead and uh, it's going to run it through a for loop, and then I'm going to go ahead and parse out the information I need, and then break that for loop once I find a match. If I don't find a match, then it will throw an error. So I can also dry that up a bit, but we're going to dry out the Axios call, and if I'm feeling up to it, I'll dry out the rest of it, because there's a little bit of stuff that you can actually do with this to make this a little bit easier, I think. So we'll see what I can do with that. Um, and it'll involve template literals. All right, so let's try this sucker out. This is just code being wet, and I don't think that's an actual real term or anything like that. It's just the opposite of dry, so deal with it. All right, so with this, I could say that this is going to be the same for all of them, except, or with exception of this variable here, like what endpoint I'm going to actually go after. And that's another thing too. Like you can see here, I highlighted team, and now it's showing me that I have this word is being used as well. So I have to do things to account for things like that. Also make some of my errors a little bit more generic, so I can actually place in certain things like that. Like maybe just take the word team here, lowercase, and then capitalize the first letters. I can do things like that as well with other helper functions that I have. But I'll get to that later, and we'll probably just mock that up. It won't be actual working code or tested code. So with this, I will take this portion. Actually, I'll take all the way up to here. And I'll create another function. We will call this, we'll make this an asynchronous function, and this will be Axios or API call. And with that API call, I'm going to take two things. I'm going to take, well, I'm going to take two strings. I'm going to take an endpoint, and I'm going to take um, endpoint. Hmm. I'm going to take endpoint name. Yeah, we'll take endpoint name. So what we'll do in this case is that endpoint name takes a string that string to represent an endpoint. All right, so what we'll do is now I'll take this Axios call. And I know I'm going to return a response. So with this, let response equal await. So I have the await keyword available. Put that there to keep that clean. The core vars, the token, it will always be the same. The URL. And this is kind of the hard part. Like, if anything, I can always pass in the URL and then also the endpoint name. So pass in URL and the endpoint name. So API URL will now be, it could still be API URL, but I don't want to be confusing later on. So I'll just make this simply a URL. And there we go. All right, so got rid of that. And this API URL, what I'll do here is I'll take this and I'll assign it to, or I'll assign the API call function to a variable. So API response and API response. And the reason why I want to do the API response is because there's some other things I need to get done here. Or that I want to use the same variable without making major changes. So for instance, this team result API response will be whatever the team result is. But I'm going to actually start doing some work with the team result itself here. All right, so API response. So now that we got API response, now I should get a response, but I just want the data because that'll be my response. So I just want the data out of that. And then here, in this case, team result will be a function. And I could make an if here. Ooh. So an iffy arrow function. And with that, I'm going to take in API response and then do stuff. So within that, I will, within API or within this, then I can actually put this code back in. Cool. So API call, it takes in two variables. We're going to take in the endpoint name and the the URL and then the endpoint name. So in this case, I will pass it API URL, which I already have defined up here, and then I will also pass it the endpoint name. So that's team, right? So with that, now I can start doing things like using template literals to actually go over the data. All right, so I'm going to make a quick change here. And I will be pausing this from time to time, give me some time to think, and then also making this video a little bit shorter. So you'll see things cut up. It's my first time doing it, so, I guess go easy on me. And it'll get better over time as I get better with this way of doing things. Usually with live streams, I can get away with just having brain farts. But I want to do a little bit better here. So npn or endpoint name or yeah, endpoint name. All right, so endpoint name will be a string. In this case, it'll be team. All right, and then what I'll do is I'll pass that as a variable, endpoint name. Oh, let's just do endpoint. Mm, all right, cool. And again, we'll use template, as I said earlier, we'll use template literal, so we'll use endpoint there. We'll pass endpoint there. Um, Even things like this. Uh, and I just got to get better with, or not get better, but I was just thinking about this and I didn't think I needed it. But things like team name, things like this, I can get away with using a template literal for it if I wanted to, and copy and paste some code and stuff like that. But I won't go too crazy with that right now. Do that another time. And the thing is, you can generalize your function so many ways, and you want to be careful with that because it can also make it a little bit more complex because now you've put on, by adding more complexity, you've added more restrictions because to allow for you to have that level of complexity in terms of like, or, sorry, not complexity, simplicity. Simplicity can add more restrictions. So by adding so many methods or ways or strings and combination or concatenation of strings, by adding so many different ways that you can simplify your code, you've actually added more restrictions. Now, if I wanted to make a if I wanted to make a change to one function, I might have to add an exception later on, which is sometimes again why I don't mind having wet code, if you will. Now, and again, that's not the way, I don't think that's the right way of saying it. It's just the opposite of dry. But I don't mind having repeated code because then I can make those small changes as needed to the code without having to add a whole bunch of different if statements or anything else like that. So while dry is a little bit easier to maintain and it's going to give you a lot of benefits later on in your code base in terms of um, making a change in one spot so it can affect many other spots. In a sense, pushing out of a patch or pushing out a change, and then it could fix maybe 100 functions. In my case, it's pretty small code bases, so it's not that big a deal. But it is something that you want to keep. You want to keep in the forefront of your mind. How can you actually make your code to where it is dry? All right. So with that being said, now I can do things like let response, and you see this data here. I can do a template literal here, and I can do an S. I can do template literal, so yeah, no, S here, S, and then endpoint. So I can do that if I wanted to with the JSON object. Same thing goes for this here if I wanted to. And this again, this is just drying it out even more. Maybe I do or do not want to do something like this. Let me pause and I'm going to work this out. All right, so added some of the some, I guess you say the skeleton or scaffolding I usually use in terms of like building a function out, having my return object, my try catch block, and my try catch block, my finally, and then of course my default error. Some of these things are already defined within the file itself, so it should fit in fairly nicely. What we always want to do is have the same type of return object so that we can actually do the same functions on it. So for instance, it always has a status, a message, and then a payload. The payload could be whatever, and then you just have to write your function, a function that receives that data to take care of that payload, because that payload could be a string or any type of variable, if you will, or data structure, I should say. So string, array, object, map, collection, whatever, something like that, or collection. This in this case here, I will go ahead and payload and assign that to response. And this is, I'm going to return the return object. It's funny, this because like Notepad++ is like closest thing I get to an IDE. So now that I have this here, now I can take the team result, and what I'm going to do with that is write a guard statement. So if team result, and we'll go ahead and uh, get something from here that's already done. So we're gonna check if there's an error. Here we go. That later. So in this case, if I take this into team result, status, throw payload, and then that should help with our catch error here. As you can see that this function is a lot smaller, and then at this point it's pretty repeatable. I can go even crazier with this if I wanted to and do this for like, get any type of ID and then just pass these same different or pass these same strings and things like that. But the problem is with with ClickUp and the way its API is set, there's certain things that will have to be done. Or, uh, for instance, like folders are in lists. I think are in folders. Spaces are within folders are within spaces. So you have to account for things like that and make sure that you're putting in, for instance, the URL itself, changing that URL where needed. So that's just definitely something that I try to account for, or I try to think about in terms of making things simpler, but it's going to take a little bit longer. All right, so let's review this a little bit here. What was done is I brought in another function. This is something that I have a part of kind of like my core functions. So capitalize first letter in a string, or capitalize first character in a string. And then I also made a new function called API call, which takes URL and endpoint name. These are both strings. Then URL gets used here. Endpoint name is not used anywhere. So what we want to do is anywhere we see endpoint, we're going to make that endpoint name. And we do want, cool, perfect. And we do want our endpoint, want it to be endpoint name, and we're not worried about this right here where it has the name, because that's actually a part of the string in the JSON object that I use for this whole ClickUp library that I'm kind of creating here, or module, I should say. And then we have the S, which we're going to concatenate, and we're using template literals to concatenate things. And following our structure in terms of having a return object that has a return object, which is a JSON object which has three keys, which is status, message, and payload. Then what we're going to do is it always defaults our status to success and our message to success message, and that could just be success as well, just to cut that down. That's probably some change we're going to make soon. And then payload will always be blank. That way I can overwrite payload with whatever I need to, and it doesn't get defaulted to anything. So here, my payload would be response, or assigned to response, or whatever the response is going to be here. Um, Now I know it says response here, and that's fine because of uh, I can get away with that because of the way because of scoping. But I can actually make that a little bit different here. So like I could put like Axios response or something like that, just to make that a little bit more uh, recognizable. That hey, this is Axios response, which is different than this response here. So boom, Axios. Oop. Now this is something I like to do, a bit OCD on my part, but I like to do things like this because then I don't get confused myself. So this response is this response, and then that's it. Now, what that does, it causes problems with variable names, and you can have all types of other issues as well in terms of just confusing yourself. But for me personally, I like to do this because it's less confusion, and I don't plan on having too many variable names within a function. If it gets to be where it's like, I have two or three, or like say like 10, 20 variable names or something like that in a function. That's a pretty big function, and maybe I need to break that up, depending. But again, I work on smaller code bases, so take that however you will, or take that with a grain of salt, I should say. So now I have Axios call or my API call function, and this API call function I'm going to take down here, and then I'm going to use it here. So API call, and then it's going to do its API call. It's going to give me an actual ID, so it should give me an object, and then within the payload of that object will be the ID. So team result dot status equals failure throw result dot payload, right? Or in this case, team result dot payload. Here, I'll take team result.payload, and what I need to do is actually reference payload there. All right, and then I can actually return that to my return object. So what I'm going to do is actually go ahead and test this code because I don't want to put out any code or a video that has code that doesn't work. So give me a second, let me test this, and then I'll be back. All right. So that took a little while to get right. What I did run into some problems here in terms of reference errors. Some variables were not available that were previously available in the function. When it was all one function, now it's just two, of course two. I did have to add another argument called target name. That replaces object or obj dot the obj dot like instance in this case team name. So now I pass that team name or that variable, which is the string that I'm looking for. I pass that to the API call. So I look up team names, space names, task names, things like that. I'll pass into this API call because essentially that is what I'm going to be searching for through the searching for the ID for once I get data back. Now, in terms of things like the endpoint name. That is correct, and that worked out well, and that got me the response that I wanted, which was my payload. Or let's put this in here. Actually, let's do this. Uh, Sorry, I just gotta. This is kind of it's not super secret stuff, but at the end of the day, I do have to have some type of security. So this is what the payload will look like. So I'll have my three keys, and then the payload will be the actual ID for the space or for the team ID. But that's an example of dry coding. Now this took me probably a little less than an hour to get done to break up the function from where it was before to where it is now. But now my resulting or my subsequent functions will all look like this, and I can give it the same type of test. Also, I can do things like, for instance, maybe get the key name out of here or something like that. But for the most part, certain blocks of code, such as, uh, excuse me, from here to here, so from line 9 to line 28 has pretty much been taken out. So that's what, how many lines is that? It should tell me how many lines I've selected. So 20 lines selected? Yeah, pretty much. So 20 lines selected. Yeah, yeah, cool. Sorry, it tells you down here, but tells 20 lines selected, or there we go, 20 lines or 483 characters. So I've taken that away and made my code base a little bit smaller. All right, so I'll be chopping this video up. As always, hey, thanks for listening. This is something that's new for me, so excuse the poor cuts, and maybe even the quiet spots. I'm gonna have to spend like a whole another hour editing this. But as always, thanks for listening. This code does work and will be uploaded to this gist, which is here. So this will be like Node ClickUp Core v2, and I'll be working on this module or library, or I'll call it module. I'll be working on this module a little bit more and making up little small updates like this as I go along, just so I can actually just so I can make it better for you all. All right. As always, thank you very much for listening. Appreciate you so much. Peace.